of course, follow with a lot of interest all the commitments about net zero in 2050 or 2060 or whatever. But the truth is, if the national determined contributions will not significantly improve in relation to emissions during this decade, we will not be able to reach 1.5 degrees. It will be irreversible to lose that possibility. But that creates a new kind of geography, because the geography in which all these things were thought was a geography in which there was developed countries that had essentially created the problem of climate change, and developing countries that were the victims of that, and then so there was a necessity of solidarity by developed countries providing developing countries with the resources necessary to mitigation, but especially to adaptation, because they were already suffering the impacts of climate change. But now we have three groups of countries. We have developed countries, we have least developed countries, and developing countries of relatively small dimension, and we have middle-income countries that are emerging economies and that are relevant from the point of view of emissions. And so the question of solidarity now is more complex. So it has a dimension with the least developed countries and the majority of the developing countries that do not contribute much to climate change. And there is what it is essential, the 100 billion to materialize, and to materialize seriously. Let's be honest, the proposal that is on the table is not entirely responding to what is needed. I mean, it needs to be clear and guaranteed, and not a postponement that eventually, according to OECD, we will be able to. I mean, I understand the frustration of developing countries, so we need to do one step further, and we need to mobilize international financial institutions for adaptation and mitigation, and we need to have 50-50 for adaptation, and we need, I mean, this is to do what was supposed to be done based on the Paris Agreement seriously in terms of financial solidarity in all its aspects. But then we have the third group of countries. And the problem is that this third group of countries have natural determined contributions in which the volume of emissions will not decrease, sometimes will even increase during the next decade, but have real difficulties in relation to their productive sectors, and namely in relation to their energy sector, extremely dependent on coal. Which means that we need to find here, naturally asking them to make the maximum effort, we need to find here mechanisms of support for them to be able to accelerate the transition, which means, in my opinion, coalitions of developed countries that have the technology and the financial capacity to, on a case-by-case basis, see how we can have a plan in which each one of these big emerging economies is able to have a reduction of emissions in the next decade compatible to keeping the 1.5, because if not, we will not get there. Of course, this means speaking seriously with China, speaking seriously with India, speaking seriously with Indonesia, with Turkey, and etc. But we cannot put it on a simple base to say, now you need to do also the same reduction that we are doing, because we have to recognize that their economies are more complicated to do so. And that so we need to find here a strong technological and financial coalition to be able to make them really reduce emissions in order to keep the 1.5, because without 1.5, there is no solidarity. The victims will be, we know. I mean, you look at SIDS in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. Look at African countries with drought that is decimating entire regions. Look at the Corredor Seco in Latin America. I mean, it is clear that these two different fronts need to be addressed. The front of the financial support to developing countries and least developed and other developing countries that are not key emitters, which is essentially what we have been discussing, the 100 billion, adaptation, etc. And then a partnership that is needed with those developing middle-income emerging economies that are today an element without which it will be impossible to preserve 1.5.